So welcome everybody to today's SPARC webcast. I'm Nick Shockey. I'm SPARC's Director of Programs and Engagement, and excited to facilitate the discussion this afternoon that really comes out of a couple different threads of conversation that we've been having at SPARC. One is a number of discussions we've had with community-owned initiatives that are really, are committed fundamentally to library values that's sort of in their DNA, but have expanded their paid-for offerings and sort of had to navigate the changing relationship with libraries as they've gone for, sort of offering everything completely for free to having more paid-for options, and that sort of changing the different parts of the library that they interact with and sort of the dynamic. And then sort of on the converse side of that, there have been a number of conversations, sort of generally within SPARC, but also particularly within our negotiation community of practice, of sort of frustration with sort of vendors that sort of clearly pursue their own profit as their sort of primary goal, but are sort of more frequently adopting sort of the language of partnership and sort of how they describe their relationships with libraries, even though I think most libraries would describe that relationship sort of as anything but a partnership. And earlier this fall, that sort of dynamic sort of was raised in a conversation we were having with Lenny and Emma from protocols.io, and we thought it would be really interesting to sort of have this discussion with protocols, to sort of talk through that dynamic from their perspective, as well as from the perspective of libraries that are working with protocols as sort of a particular instantiation of this dynamic. And so we're thrilled to have our three speakers this afternoon to sort of talk through this vendors partners distinction within the context of protocols, but also more broadly as well. We will first hear from Kathleen De Laurenti, who is the director of the Arthur Friedheim Library at Johns Hopkins University and the co-lead of the reinvestment working group of SPARC's negotiation community of practice. Then we will hear from Lenny. We talked about pronunciations right before, and I psyched myself out. So Tatelman from the CEO of protocols.io, who will share sort of an overview of sort of protocols.io's approach to aligning with library values and some more recent developments there of really baking that into the structure of protocols.io. And then finally, we'll hear from Liz Grace, who is the head of collections and systems at the Edward Miner Library at the University of Rochester, who will speak to their experience in working with protocols.io and sort of their particular viewpoint on sort of working with them, sort of from that vendor partner distinction. So we'll have, the presentations sort of first, and then hopefully have plenty of time for discussion afterwards. Would definitely invite folks to ask questions or make comments in the chat throughout the presentation. And again, we are recording today's session, so just something to be aware of, when submitting comments that will be captured in the recording afterwards. But again, please feel free to make comments or ask questions in the chat at any point during the presentation, so we have lots of grist for the Q&A afterwards. And with that, I will invite Kathleen to kick us off with sort of the viewpoint on this issue from the perspective of the reinvestment working group within the community of practice. Kathleen.
Thank you so much, Nick. Thanks for having me here today. It's kind of exciting to talk a little bit about our group and our work, and to get some feedback, I hope, from some of the attendees today about how we can start refining the work that we're doing to be most useful to the community. I think that this has been a really stressful and exciting time to be thinking about how we're moving forward with open, especially as we are starting to, or maybe never, I change my mind every day, emerge from being amidst a global pandemic. The reinvestment working group had our very first meeting the last week of February 2020. So if you can remember the before times, was about 2 weeks before my institution went into lockdown and sent everyone home. And it's been really interesting to see how that's, I think, challenged some of the assumptions that we had going into that group about what our work was going to be, and also really made it challenging. When we first met, it was lots of conversations about the University of California and how they had not renewed with Elsevier. What kinds of opportunities do those kinds of decisions present our organizations with? How can we help people come up with reinvestment strategies that will help us retain those resources if those kinds of contracts go away? We don't want to just see that money being reabsorbed into university budgets and repurposed for other things. We know that that can have a big impact on the work that we're doing. But I think COVID kind of derailed, I think, a lot of the momentum that was moving in that direction with our organizations. We have seen a lot more demand for digital access. I think I'm certainly seeing that at my organization. We saw that borne out in the SPARC report on COVID impacts, but not necessarily for open, that there's just been demands to get what people need. There's been less emphasis on whether it's open or not, I think, from our external community members. I think it has brought into strong relief for those of us working in these spaces, just how important it is to start to accelerate some of that movement, though. I think that, we've all been dealing with curricular changes and all kinds of things wrapped around the way that our relationships with publishers have been changing over the last 18 to 24 months, and that they've been trying to respond to different pricing models. We've been trying to respond to different pricing models. And I think it's been really challenging time. I think that we're also looking at how we can continue to move this organization forward when now we're dealing with budget cuts. So I think organizations that may be looking at breaking a big deal, that are thinking about, how could we strategize reinvesting these resources? It's going towards making up deficits. I think that many of our organizations are dealing with. So I think that changes some of that perspective that we had on what can we do with open and how do we get towards investing in that. And I think that that's really made our work in the working group really challenging. How do we try to tell stories that help libraries through this time when everything was so uncertain and everybody's unique, I think, individual situations seemed more at play than ever across our library community, at least certainly from my perspective. There have been two things I think that have come up and that are really starting to come into focus for the group's work. I think we're really seeing in these conversations, and I think in the SPARC report, that the impact in the way that open operates in our organizations has really exploded across every part of our operations. So, something that when I first became a librarian was really focused on how do we get faculty to be invested in rights retention? How do we get some infrastructure to support faculty publishing initiatives or flipping journals in our organizations has now become a much bigger conversation and a much bigger part of our conversations with vendors that we're having. It's moving into bigger aspects of infrastructure than I think it has in the past. And I think there's a lot of question around where is that infrastructure going to come from? How are we going to support it? Where are the strategic partners that we want to have in those infrastructure initiatives? And then I think that one of the things that concerns me the most, just personally, and that we're going to be looking at quite a bit with the group is, what do we do about people resources? So one of the more worrisome aspects that the SPARC report had for me was to see that one of the first places where organizations divested was people. And I think that getting people back is going to be a priority, but how can we think about what the right kinds of positions are and the right kind of skill sets that we need in our organizations to advance some of these areas around open? I'm really excited today because I think that what today's conversation will do, I hope, is kind of call into question some of what I think of as the proxification that we sometimes do in libraries that we're always encouraging our community members to avoid. I continue to hear in some of these conversations that, that we need to be thinking about nonprofit partners, that we need to be thinking about all partnerships with scholarly presses are good or society presses are good, and that's the priority of how we get to bibliodiversity and supporting a really rich, diverse publishing landscape. And I think that we need to remind ourselves that we need to be critical about those opportunities, and we need to be thinking about who the right partners are for the right kinds of tasks and operations that we need to explore. So I'm really excited about the conversation today and to really hear more about what Protocols is doing and how they could be a partner for some of the work that we're doing in libraries. The second question that I have is really for this group that we're thinking about in the reinvestment working group is really in the name. We were formed and charged to think about reinvestment, what happens when we have new dollars from previous investments that aren't really new. And what we're finding is that the part of reinvestment is not the case of how things are happening in every organization. We're especially seeing some differences between state institutions and private institutions and what kind of flexibility they have with investing those dollars, depending on what their budgeting processes are. So I'm really interested to hear from this group if it would be more helpful for us in our work to be thinking about this from more of an investment perspective and thinking about reinvestment as an aspect of that, because it's a question that we continue to struggle with in the group around what the best way forward is with that. And I thought this might be a great day and time to ask for some community input in that. So I'll be curious to hear what you say. Please make any comments in the chat. I think my email is out there and available if anybody wants to respond or might be interested in learning more about the group's work or potentially joining us in this work. And with that, I will turn it over to our next panelists.
Thanks so much, Kathleen. Lenny, over to you.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you, Kathleen. Thank you, Liz, for joining, and thank you to SPARC for organizing this and everybody who's on the call. Just listening to you, Kathleen, I had a lot of thoughts, so hopefully I won't just talk about what I was planning, but that there will be opportunity in the discussion to also touch on a lot of these things because they triggered a lot of experiences in the history of Protocols.io. But when I was preparing for this, I was thinking about Protocols.io as a company when we got started in 2012, that we had a good mission. One thing that hasn't changed in Protocols.io from before we launched in 2014, when we just thought of how do we build it, what should be the business model. Open access was at the center of it. Like, we knew that the public sharing has to be free to read, free to publish. When we launched, the mission was to improve reproducibility. So there were already good things in Protocols.io. But when I think about us historically as a startup with seed funding, constrained with resources, on the brink of bankruptcy for the first several years and not knowing if you'll exist tomorrow or not, we were very limited in what we had, what was on Protocols.io, how we were thinking about long-term preservation and stability, right? And we might have had a good core, but we were not a good partner. And I was thinking about the evolution of Protocols.io, and what I wanted to start the conversation with in these couple of minutes before turning it over to Liz was just to talk a little bit about what is not the role, but what is the power that you as librarians have to actually shape particularly startups. So I'm talking from the Protocols.io from a startup perspective, but how you can push us towards aligning more, towards being good partners. And before librarians, the very earliest examples I'm thinking of are the roles that publishers and funders played in the formative years, 2014, 2015, when we launched. And I think it was 2015 when we got the first grant from the Gordon Betty Moore Foundation. And the first deliverable from it was to develop a public API and document it well, right? Like, you don't have it as a startup on day one, right? Someone needs to fund it. Someone needs to push you towards doing this, set it as priority. And we've benefited tremendously from having it, right? We always bring it up when we present. We've had lab notebooks connect to us, but it wasn't something we had on day one. Long-term preservation was connecting to clocks. That was something that was a requirement from Public Library of Science before 2017 announcement that they're adding Protocols.io to author guidelines. It was a precondition, right? And so those are examples of organizations that can push a startup, can push a platform to do better and to align more. And since, our business model, like you were talking about, Nick, has evolved. We started with, it's just going to be free for academics. We're not charging universities. We will make money on reagent vendors because protocols have reagents in them. People will click on reagents, we'll charge commissions for those reagents. So that was in the first business plan of Protocols.io. We had no intention of ever charging for Protocols.io from the researchers. And it took us about 2 years to realize that's not going to work. There are examples of other people trying to do that. And for a number of reasons, that doesn't work. So we gave up on that. We were sticking with, okay, it's still free for researchers. So we're exploring other business models. And then we thought we'll aggregate and anonymize the use of protocols and reagents, and it will be the analytics that publishers, reagent vendors can benefit from. And we had a little bit of success with it, and then realized that those were exceptions to the rule. And unless we have millions of people visiting us daily, there's just not enough data, right? And that business model is not going to work out. And so from 2014, I think, till 2018, we're exploring different business models. We'll charge industry, but most of our users are academics. So how are you going to charge industry if you're trying to build a knowledge base and the partnerships with journals, with funders, and the people you've been approaching are all academic, right? Industry will take time. So it was only 2018, I think, when we arrived at the change. We'll keep the open sharing free, but for private collaboration, just like GitHub, we need to charge. And that's when we started approaching universities. So that took a while, and we did have exactly that switch from completely free to free for the Wikipedia-like side of public sharing and charge for the private, which I think is actually a really good business model that's aligned. It's fair and it's aligned with what the researchers need and what we're responsive to. But that aside, 2019 was the year that the first university, Carnegie Mellon, signed up. And when I think back to just how much work it was for the first university to work through what the contract is like, right? I think the entire, we don't charge much for the annual license, campus-wide license. It's like the cost of 1 or 2 Nature publications in an open access journal for everyone. But they probably spend orders of magnitude more just on the legal back and forth, having their legal department think through what is the contract. We've never had one with the university. And that exercise and many other conversations with librarians, and after you sign up, they've been progressively making us think of really important questions, like what's the answer to the scenario where university doesn't renew Protocols.io, right? Like what happens? All these researchers are on Protocols.io. What's your answer to what if we don't renew? And we had to figure out with the first universities, what's that setup? Luckily, we've only had renewals since 2019 and never had a cancellation, but it's these conversations with librarians that have made us put into the contract that if it's not renewed, researchers continue to have access to all of their workspaces, to all of their protocols, can export everything. There's no loss of data, right? It's not a lock-in, and they can elect to pay for their own group if they want to continue using it in private mode and putting in more protocols, or they need to make their things public and then free up the private space and use it in a free mode like everyone else. But that avoiding the lock-in was a key answer. And there are many examples like it. Several times accessibility came up before a university would sign a contract, right? Are you doing the minimum? Are you at industry standard? That had an impact on the entire platform, right? Like it made us spend energy and think about these things. More recent example is integration with the Center for Open Science's Open Science Framework. And that was entirely universities where the librarians already pay for OSF. asking us, can you enable mirroring from protocols.io to OSF? Right? So these are all examples of steps since 2014 that have been bringing us closer to where we need to be. We're not perfect, right? The other part was the questions around, okay, you have long-term preservation with clocks, but what about downtime? What if there is a disruption to the service, right? If you become an integral place for protocols, what happens if your Amazon server is hacked, if there's denial of service attack, these things happen. Where do the researchers find the protocols? And those conversations pushed us right before the pandemic to reach out to the Internet Archive, and they've started mirroring all of the public protocols. They've pushed us, just like OSF, to make export easier to Dropbox, to Google Drive. But the point that I'm trying to make is that we started out, I think, with a good mission and the right approach towards the public sharing, but no company, no startup launches with all of these things in place. And I think the point that I'm trying to make is that you as librarians have a lot of power in these conversations to steer us, because you're thinking about provenance, you're thinking about preservation, you're thinking about the what ifs, what if Elsevier buys you. You've seen these things happen over and over, and you're thinking of them in a way that's different from maybe a junior researcher or the company itself. And I've seen over and over requests and questions that we had to address that make us a better service, make us more aligned. We still have work to do, and I don't want to take all of the time. So I think I'm going to stop there with just one last thing being, for younger companies like Protocols.io itself, rather than established bigger vendors and entities, the question I think is also, are they listening, right? When you're asking the questions, when you're suggesting improvements, are you being blown off, or do we come back and say, that's actually a really good request, and this is what we're going to do to address it? So I have many examples of things where we improved. I don't want to list them all. I'd rather save time for Q&A, so I'll stop there.
Thanks so much, Lenny. Yeah, Liz.
Thank you. So I think, I don't know, I've just been reflecting on how we started with Protocols.io, and it was kind of, it was kind of a wild, like looking back, it was kind of a wild decision to actually sign. Sorry, Lenny. We signed pretty early in the pandemic. It was early April of 2020, when I think we snuck in right after our budgets were completely frozen for the remainder of the fiscal year. So it was like the one last hurrah before pretty much everything was closed out that we weren't already contractually obligated to purchase. But it was good. I think in terms of the library being a partner for the institution, kind of supporting different areas of need, we received a faculty request from one person in particular, and then she kind of recruited, I think, a few others to get on board and kind of start applying pressure. But she was very transparent. She said, I read this blog post. This product sounds amazing. We need it. And she kind of wasn't taking no for an answer, even though she knew that, like, things were pretty strained. Everybody was pretty stressed. Aren't we all still stressed though? So she got her colleagues on the scientific advisory committee to also chime in and say that this was definitely something that we needed. And the more I looked into it and the more information that I got back from Protocols.io, I realized that everything pretty much aligned with the priorities and the values that are important to the institution, but also specifically to the library's licensing principles and requirements that we have from vendors that have since been officially published. I've never actually shared them with Protocols.io, but some of the values are transparency, sustainability, equity, reproducibility, and flexibility. And I felt like we've always gotten all of those things from working with Lenny and his team. But I think the faculty members were specifically interested in open access and reproducibility, all to enhance the scientific integrity of their work. So they work with students. I know that they push their students to also use Protocols.io. It's been really useful and beneficial as a tool for, I think, both mentors and mentees as they are working on their, I don't know. I don't actually know what they do. They work down the hall for me, but I'm not invited into the labs. But this is definitely, I think it's all reflected in the growth of use. So I get quarterly statistics from Emma at Protocols.io, and it's shown steady growth pretty consistently. I think the first quarter it was like probably a handful of people that requested it, and then some other people that they recruited. But I mean, since then it's been pretty steady growth. We have lots of users. We have several handfuls of private protocols, and we do even have some public protocols at this point as well, which is exciting because I know people use it for different reasons, but I don't know. I was excited about the public aspect. I really wanted it to be shared and open access and something that everybody can get their hands on. So that was really what sold me, and I think sold the library to participate in this license. So people who like it, I don't think they just like it, they love it. And Lenny on his side, I think, has been really great in making sure that we have education, and that if anybody has questions, there are materials for them to refer back to. They've done webinars. I don't know, and the faculty that requested it, I think they've been like excited that there was extra educational platforms for more users to go learn about it, sign up, and start using it. So it's been nothing but great, honestly.
Great, thanks much, Liz. So we have lots of time for discussion. So before I use moderator's privilege to ask some questions, we'll just go ahead and sort of invite folks to go ahead and submit comments or questions in the chat. And sort of as folks are thinking about questions to ask, I do have a couple of follow-ups. And Liz, as you were talking, it sounded like part of the decision to invest in Protocols.io, if I'm understanding correctly, was sort of grounded in sort of the values framework at Rochester. And I'm curious if you could speak a little bit more to sort of, I don't know, the alignment there or how that intersects, because it's, sort of this conversation around making values-based investments, has been a big point of conversation in the negotiation community of practice, particularly within Kathleen's group. And just in this particular context, I'm just wondering if there's sort of anything else you can share about sort of the alignment or the role that played in the investment decision.
Sure. So the University of Rochester has a few different libraries. It's kind of a decentralized institution, but the libraries have been working pretty significantly to try to band together, and we license for the institution. Not just like little divisions. That's not what we want to be in the business of. So anything that we purchase, I mean, it kind of goes through this process. For a while, we had an internal checklist. It's actually an external checklist. Once we have an institutional electronic resources management committee. So we put all of these kind of priorities, values, and it's always been a checklist that we've used to kind of go through when we're working with vendors. And I think as it's become more concrete, there were definitely licenses that I've looked at and like, these don't really meet the expectations that we want our vendors to meet. But I don't know, Protocols.io, honestly, it was like, it happened, I feel like it happened like 10 lifetimes ago at this point, but I have all these emails saved from it. So I was kind of like looking back, but it like very concretely, I mean, the license is not this like tomb where you're like, oh my gosh, what are they trying to like pull over our eyes? It's just like, I mean, it's pretty straightforward. I think transparent is probably the word I'm looking for. It's straightforward, transparent, and that definitely I think the services that Protocols.io provides, I mean, it seemed like a no-brainer. We kind of value these certain things for our vendors, and we were getting this like pretty much upfront from Protocols.io. So I think like in terms of institutional values, yeah, that definitely played a huge part in purchasing.
And Kathleen, I'm wondering if there are sort of any parallels, from sort of Liz's Rochester specific example with, some of the discussions within the reinvestment working group, that might be useful to pull out.
I think there's a lot of parallels about some of the conversations we're having about what we think people want. I know that I think one thing that we're hopefully going to revisit soon is the question of can we invite member organizations that have these kinds of principles to share them? When we first started our work, many people didn't have them. And the conversation was much more focused on how do we create resources or help people think through what developing that kind of framework looks like. But I think that there are more examples out there now than we had to work with. So I think starting to pull those documents together so folks can see what's happening across the landscape will be really useful.
And just to pull this around to you, Lenny, before we dive into some of the questions that are coming in, curious if you could speak a bit more, sort of building on Liz's and Kathleen's answer of, has there been an evolution in the ways that Protocols.io sort of talked about itself in terms of alignment with values? Is that something that you're doing more, or making more of a selling point to libraries, or is it more, still on the functionality that the tool itself is actually providing?
So it's been the way we present protocols. We actually realized that, all I think about is reproducibility and my own experience of when I spent that year and a half in my presentations, when I talk about that year and a half of correcting a step of a protocol and not being able to share it with anyone, not getting credit. So that's naturally what I talk about. But then I realized that when we present to the librarians, overemphasizing reproducibility, it's natural, it's what we do. But that's the open access and free part. And we've realized that in many of the presentations, the librarian comes away with, well, we have these 200 people with accounts already. They're all free. They're using it for public sharing. Why should the library pay if they're already using it? And so actually what we realized since 2019 is that we need to talk more about why are we asking the library to pay? What is that private side? So we've actually de-emphasized reproducibility. We have, we've talked about some of these, like what do we do for preservation? What do we do for mirroring, archiving, export? But we realized that we weren't explicitly mentioning these things on our help page, right? So we've added sections. When we're asked for a contract, we have all these things. We talk about how there is no lock-in, but I think in our presentations, we tend to focus more on here's what the campus-wide plan is, and even talking less about reproducibility than we used to. And I think there's a fine line between saying, oh, we're aligned, we're a partner, we've never used that language. But if I'm being totally honest, right now recently we were having an internal conversation, should we call that campus-wide license subscription? Because I come from, my PhD was in the Eisen lab, right? Like in the first 2-3 librarians I talked to, I actually had to, the only thing I could say about why you should trust us back in 2018 was, I did my PhD in the Eisen lab and I support open access, right? But that's not nearly enough. I'm CEO today, I might not be tomorrow. But when we talk about subscription, I think about Elsevier, Wiley, Taylor Francis, like we're not a journal, we're not a subscription. Does the word subscription lead people to think, it's a book, it's a journal, and you're in this wrong pigeonhole. On the other side, if we say purchase a license, does that sound like IT? Is that something that libraries do? So when it comes to language, we don't, in our presentations, we haven't talked about alignment so much. and I don't know if that would be crass, and I don't know if maybe we should. I haven't actually thought about that, how we present. We just talk about the features and what the campus-wide plan is, but we're having internal conversations. What word do we use? Membership, maybe, yeah. That someone just suggested it, and that's probably the much better word. There are also a lot of questions I see in the chat that are coming in, so I want to shut up.
Appreciate it, Lenny. The response, not the your last comment. Yeah, I think this is a good point to just clear through a couple of those first questions for Liz, just around protocols IO specifically. So Liz, you want to respond to Michelle's question about protocols as a pedagogical tool?
You know, I actually don't know the answer to that question. I know that some of our biomedical graduate students definitely have used it, but I don't know if it's been in the classroom or if it's just been more like you're doing this research, you have a lab protocol, so get on protocols IO and do it. I'm not actually sure what the answer is to that.
Lenny, any sense?
The majority of the use is either when you're publishing the paper or to organize methods inside your research team. But we do have public examples of classroom use of protocols IO. And in the quarterly reports that we send to all of the librarians, sometimes I'll see like, oh, there's just in this quarter an extra 100 people that joined, and you take a look, and that is a class, and that can be both public or private setting. But I would say that that's probably more, maybe around 10% of the use of protocols IO is for teaching, and 90% is for active research and method development. Just from our side at Rochester specifically, I don't know.
Skip down to a point that Robin made in the chat about, sort of how do we frame the job of the library supporting local and campus needs, like protocols and supporting open infrastructure that might not be so obviously related to research and teaching. And Kathleen, I'm curious if, sort of you have a response to that from the reinvestment side. And, one other, sort of related, sort of a thought I had coming into this discussion was how helpful is it to sort of have, tools that quantify sort of alignment with values, and sort of seeing, some efforts coming online, like the PAPI guidelines, like the Next Generation Library publishing their values and principles framework that sort of work to try to start to, sort of quantify what alignment is and the extent to which, sort of vendors are or not in alignment. And I'm curious, like, sort of related to Robin's question, if those feel useful, in analyzing the different investment opportunities on the library side, and then sort of Lenny on your side, curious, if those kind of explicit frameworks, are they useful in sort of trying to align with library values, on the vendor side?
I think that they're useful, but I think where I get concerned is when tools like that end up becoming codified because we don't have the kinds of qualitative information from our communities that we need to start to make some of those local prioritization decisions. And I think that that's a challenge that many of us still have, 20 some years into conversations about open access, still really understanding or helping our communities understand some of these things better so that we can let their needs and interests kind of also play into that part of the equation. So I think that we have to continue to think about how we're going to balance those things, and those tools are helpful. I hope that they'll be helpful in some of these community conversations, the way that some of the OER conversations have developed, as far as being able to bring some organizations like OpenStax into conversation with university leadership so that we can build better understanding there and get more community involvement.
So from my side, I wonder how much I think it's really good to communicate what the expectations are. But obviously, some will take advantage of it and just overfit and say the right things without doing the right things. And I think for us, what I was scared of from the very beginning was hearing from one of the early people at Mendeley that, you can get librarians to sign up, but they're really good at dropping things that are not used. Right? And the renewal is the really hard part. And so I've just been, from day one, terrified that we get that initial campus-wide license for a year and then no one uses us and it's dropped, right? And so that's where all of the training, the dedicated support, answering most things within half an hour, right? Or an hour. And just thinking like, what will Liz need to see in order to justify renewing, and being terrified of that renewal not happening. So when you communicate those things, like there are universities that ask us to send a survey on their behalf to all of the users, right? And then ask them to directly contact the librarian with feedback before they decide to renew. And so knowing that those are things that are expected off of us keeps the vendor on their toes and makes them think, how do we grow adoption? What do we report to the librarian? And I think it relates to the question that I see in the chat, which was, how does someone like Protocols.io decide what feedback requests and suggestions from librarians to follow, right? Like, what do we focus on? Why did we decide to partner with Open Science Framework? How do we choose? Because we are still constrained, right? We are a small team. And that's a related question. If we see what the expectations are, that helps. But also constantly thinking about the researcher. We know that the librarian will very frequently go back to researchers and say, are they answering your questions? Is this still a useful tool? Do you want us to continue paying for it, like looking at adoption? And so for us, prioritizing who we integrate with, what functionality we add, what goes into the help page, what we need to address, a lot of it is tied to, does this benefit the researcher, right? Like, will many people ask for it? So when librarians asked us for OSF, we went to our scientific advisory, like the active researchers, students and postdocs that are our ambassadors, and we asked them, how many of you use OSF, right? Like, is this something that will help you? So we try to see what's broadly applicable and just makes the platform better, rather than optimizing specifically for a given university or a given request. Like, does that benefit the researchers? Should we integrate with ORCID and let you sign in with that, right? Who is using it?
I'd just like to add on the infrastructure side that one thing I would really like to see happen more broadly in the library community is some discussion about a progressive approach to supporting open infrastructure. I would say, like, in the very niche space I work in with music and media, we have a pretty successful example of that with something that's not open infrastructure. But the reality is some organizations have more resources to put towards this than others. And I think it would be helpful when we think about this question of balancing, if we just had more open conversations about what some of the organizations that have resources can start to invest in, and alleviate some of that stress from smaller organizations that will never be able to invest in open infrastructure at the level that some bigger partners can, so that there can be more focus and investment on some of these other kinds of partnerships and things that are going to be really critical to local impact.
Mm-hmm. And following up on Robin's sort of question / comment in the chat, and well, I guess both Robins. Liz, I'm curious if it seems like sort of the values framework at Rochester would be helpful in sort of providing a grounding for making those investments that are helpful in creating a healthier ecosystem, but might take time to sort of grow into like wide use at Rochester. And I'm curious if that seems to hold, if sort of having that sort of values framework might provide more leeway within the library to, sort of make investments that, to the original point from Robin, may see some use, but take time to really grow, or that are, sort of more investments in a healthier ecosystem more widely, rather than sort of a immediate, sort of transactional payoff.
Certainly. I think even before we really had these like published and fleshed out for public use, you can't, I think you can't really decide on use in a single year, right? Like if we'd signed with protocols.io for a single year, I think it would, you wouldn't have the full picture, right? I think, it does take some time for adoption to actually take place and kind of get some legs going. And so I think knowing that certain vendors and certain licenses kind of apply back to these values that we hold. If absolutely nobody was using it, if like use was totally abysmal, like that's kind of hard to justify, like turning around and being like, sure, we'll pay you again. But if you're not using like multi-year licenses, and it is kind of hard to sometimes be like, okay, we're going to keep trying, even though this might not necessarily be as successful as we thought it was going to be. But I think, like I said, it takes some time. And I think also the past few years have been kind of strange for use. I think some resources were getting used a lot more heavily than they have in the past, because people either like didn't have another option, or they didn't even realize that they needed these resources, or that they existed until they absolutely needed them. But yeah, I think, I don't know, just if you're going to invest for at least more than a year or two, just to kind of get a better picture of what it looks like for the community.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really appreciate those 2 points from Robin Sinn and Robin Champieux. And I'm curious if we've actually sort of addressed those fully, or if there might be any follow-ups from, from either, or someone else in the, who's listening in. One other, sort of related, sort of question that I had for the group is, to what extent do you feel, sort of the sort of durable values alignment with, say protocols specifically, or just, sort of vendors in general? We've talked quite a bit about how, that's, something that libraries, certainly on the call are paying close attention to. And I think more libraries are paying, attention to and acting on. But I'm curious, sort of first particularly to you both, Liz and Kathleen, to what extent is that, sort of like values alignment sort of manifest in conversations with faculty around these tools that the libraries, sort of investing in? Is that values alignment sort of a discussion point with faculty, and sort of, talking about what tools the library is making available, the ways in which, that values alignment creates a healthier, sort of research ecosystem? Or is it just more narrowly focused on, sort of the, sort of use that faculty can get out of the tool, and that values alignments, more an internal sort of discussion point for the library more than it is, in conversations with faculty?
I know for certain, at least in this case, the faculty were very interested in this product because it aligned with the values. And I don't know if I could necessarily say, I don't know if we can separate the institutional values from their personal kind of scientific professional values, because I think those overlap a fair amount, but definitely the open access and reproducibility were, that was what was driving the conversation on their end, and kind of, I think, showing us that that was important to them was a central part of that conversation.
Mm-hmm.
We have some examples of some things where we really try to bring that into the conversation with our faculty here, but I think one of the things that makes it particularly challenging at Johns Hopkins is how fractured our university community is. We don't have a singular faculty senate. Everything is divisional. So, but the library is licensed for the whole university is in its entirety. So it can be a little bit tricky with the way that we're communicating that. Where we're really starting right now is how do we work documentation of progress towards some of these things into our process. So our scholarly communications group is looking at some resources for our collections group. And one thing that we were thinking about is when we can't get like those perfect values alignments, how do we articulate that internally, and how do we set goalposts for ourselves about how to keep that conversation moving further? So it's not just a concession and then that concession becomes the stopping point.
Yeah, I think that's really resonates with me and sort of some of the conversations we've been having internally at SPARC about sort of the goals of the reinvestment, or not the reinvestment, the negotiation community practice more broadly. Certainly the reinvestment working group is part of that, but just in recognizing that these changes take time, and it's about, I think, working towards sort of a recalibration of relationships over time, rather than sort of expecting that folks can make big shifts very quickly. And sort of putting the pieces in place for, recalibrating away from vendors, where there isn't values alignment, or, sort of, values are directly in conflict rather than being out of alignment, and over time, shifting to invest more in, sort of partners that actually, meaningfully align with libraries' values.
Yeah, and I'm sure like many other organizations, there's not agreement about that internally, right? Even across the library, some people are just ready to like cut the ties and run and move forward to the new horizon, and it's not that easy for everyone. And I think it's especially difficult in a community like ours to get faculty endorsement or a shared faculty vision around this. And so one of the things we're working towards is to get faculty group together that can help start driving some of that conversation and starting to create some shared vision across the divisions here.
When sort of following up on that particular point, Kathleen, I'm curious for sort of the folks that are on the webcast, if there are any good practices or any sort of lessons learned from either Hopkins or the reinvestment working group, or Liz at Rochester, just about how to build that support for values-based decision making internally. For any folks that might be on the call that sort of personally really value values alignment. Sorry. But have to make that case, to the wider institution in order to, actually create that change. Are there any sort of tips or tricks or good practices that, come immediately to mind, that folks are sort of, that are involved in that internal advocacy in their library might be able to use?
I would say, oh, go ahead.
I was going to let you off the hook for going first this time, Liz. I think one thing that has been important for me to think about, I am one of those people who's anxious and ready to start making some moves, is to try to figure out strategies for meeting people where they are. So I think that like this idea around how do we document progress, and how do we feel okay with making some of these compromises sometimes when it's clear that like we are at the stopping point with a particular vendor or potential partner, has been really important. So I think that if you can think about things like that, is there something we can do that keeps the progress moving with even when we haven't gotten where we want to be? I think that is a really important thing to try to do, and making sure that you're then holding yourselves internally accountable to that documentation and practice.
I would say at Rochester, I mean, we kind of come up to this hurdle a bunch, just in like different areas. It's not everybody agrees on everything all the time. And I think you'd make yourself crazy trying to please everybody. But I think it's kind of like a general consensus. If the group in general aligns with this type of value, and like, you kind of, it's hard. I don't think there's one right answer. And I think it's also kind of contextual for like each different situation. It's not like we have a blanket answer for everything.
Lene.
I'm just thinking, I know we're coming up on the end of the hour, but I was thinking about what Kathleen was saying about what's the capacity of some big organizations, small organizations, in this point of meeting people where they are. And for startups, it's particularly challenging, right? Like we didn't open source our code. And one of the reasons is we haven't had the capacity to do that. There are parts that we'd love to open source. And we haven't been able to really do it well and in the way that it needs to be. There are questions that still come up like, oh, you send a PDF to clocks, that's great, but that's a PDF and you have videos, you have dynamic content and questions that build up over time. Where does that knowledge go? Where do the videos go if you're mirroring with Internet Archive the PDF? And we're working towards answering that, but some of these things are just, even though we launched in 2014, I still consider us young and we've always been constrained and underfunded. And it helps us when you ask us for these things, but some of these, if you require perfect checks on all of the things from a startup, we will never be able to meet it. So some of that flexibility is not just appreciated, but it's make or break for platforms like Protocols.io. But you can come back and you can see what is our progress. Are you acting on these things, or is it just, yeah, we'll do it. Ask us in a year, and then you keep getting the same thing over and over.
That's really helpful, and Lenny, I think it's a really helpful sort of thinking about the other side of the dynamic of recalibration. Is what that looks like on sort of the vendor/partners side, that it takes time to recalibrate on the other side towards alignment. And the most important thing, I think, to both Kathleen and Liz's point, being sort of tracking progress towards that goal and creating accountability. And I appreciate your sort of putting that point in, Lenny, to help us think about what it's like on the other side of sort of the equation. But again, to Kathleen's point, making sure that it's accountability, not just like nice words about sort of aligning with values. And I appreciate Robin's comment about sort of values-based decision making becoming much more of a point of discussion. One other thing that I was hoping we might have time for, but we've clearly run out, is just the heartening moves that some consortia are making around values-based decision making, like Neural in particular, or Orbis Cascade, that I think is showing more momentum here. But I think we'll unfortunately have to leave it there today, but want to again thank Lenny, Kathleen, and Liz for joining us for this conversation. I wish we had more time to keep it going. This has been a lot of fun, and I think that this is sort of this conversation around sort of the distinction between thinking about sort of vendors as vendors or as full partners is one that we'll hope to continue. And I think the utility that's borne out in this conversation. So thank you again to you three, as well as folks, for joining us this afternoon, and have a lovely rest of your day. Bye all.